Welcome to Big Closet's Small Planet. My name is Mike Schrager, and this is a special edition for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action's Climate Action Week. Today we wanted to talk to one of our company signatories, H&M. H&M being a very, very, very well-known brand across the world, and also the biggest, I would say, company in our group of signatories. In fact, I have some data not from 2024, but from 2023, which shows the following. The emissions in 2023 with H&M in our whole group were 8.9 million around tons. And without H&M, all the other companies combined was only about 1.9 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So you can imagine in our group, H&M is the biggest emitter. We are glad to have them because our role in STICA is to both hold our signatories accountable, which H&M is one, but also to praise and highlight leadership where they're doing groundbreaking work and to get insights from that work. And so today we are going to talk to two of the sustainability experts from H&M who are working actively with climate action, Henrik Sundberg and Kim Hellström. And so I'd like them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into it. So maybe we can begin with you, Henrik.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Henrik Sundberg. I'm a climate impact lead in the Central Sustainability Department at H&M Group. So basically responsible for the climate topic across the group's different brands and functions. So handing over to Kim to introduce himself as well.
So my name is Kim Hellström, and I am working with one of the functions reporting into the climate overview. I work in production. I'm based out of Hong Kong, and I'm focusing on decarbonizing our supply chain with our basically working directly towards the factories and the suppliers running those factories.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's get into it. H&M as a group, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, has set targets to reduce your absolute scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions by 56% by 2030 against a 2019 baseline. And when it comes to scope 3, where a majority of the emissions are, you also set a sort of goal by 56% reductions by 2030 against the 2019 baseline. And you've also set targets to reduce the absolute scope of 1 and 2 emissions by 90% by 2040 and to reduce absolute scope 3 GHG emissions by 90% by 2040. So all against the 2019 baseline. In 2040, your overall target is to reach net zero by balancing out any remaining emissions through the use of permanent carbon dioxide removal. So that is what you set as a target, what we're holding you accountable for, what in relation to global standards are saying you should be doing. So what I want to ask to start is, from your perspective, I have my own views, but from your perspective, how is H&M doing when it comes to reaching these goals? What do the numbers say? Are you on track to meet the 2030 goal? And how are you thinking about your 2040 goal? Who wants to start there?
Yeah, maybe I can start. And I'm impressed you managed to kind of sort all of these out. It gets kind of technical right away when you get into the target setting. But just like you said, we have kind of a set of near-term targets. So the 2030 targets, which is reducing emissions by 56%. And we have that for both scope 1 and 2, where we have done quite good progress lately, about 41% down since the base year of 2019. So we're making quite good progress on that front. And that's a lot when it comes to scope 1 and 2. I mean, that's basically emissions from our own facilities, some company cars, heating stores, and mostly electricity. So when it comes to scope 1 and 2, it's mostly about electricity and making sure we use green electricity or renewables when we try that. So we were at about 96%, I think it was last year, of renewable electricity. We're also trying to source a large part of that from kind of newly built plants that we are part of building ourselves then through what's called a PPA. So that's kind of, I would say, for scope 1 and 2, the progress is quite good and driven by this renewables development that we're looking at. And scope 1 and 2 is less than 1% of our total emissions. Of course, it's much closer to us, something we have tighter control of, but most of the magic happens in scope 3.
All right, so tell us about scope 3, because that's where, if it's 1%, so what do we do with scope 3? Tell us about how you're doing there.
Yeah, so we in last year, or for 24, we had reduced with about 24% since 2019. So we're about halfway in terms of time on the journey, and about halfway in terms of the reductions we need to make as well. We're slightly higher in emissions than last year, a few percentage points than last year, and that's mostly due to an increase in air shipments that has happened. And also there's a small increase in the material weights. So there's been some heavier materials used and some bigger garments produced, and that has kind of increased the weights as well compared to previously. But it's quite a small difference compared to last year. So we can, I would say, in overall, we can see we are doing quite well on the trajectory towards the 2030 targets.
So you have around 23, I'm reading the exact numbers in the report here, 23.7% reduction since the 2019 base year for scope 3 emissions. Your goal is to get by 2030, what did we say, 56%, right? Okay. So, and it's 2025 now. This is 2024 numbers. So you have only a few more years to get to 56%. So that's the context that we're speaking about. And do you think about already now the 2040 goal? Is there something you want to say about that?
Well, I think, the 2040 goal is kind of the next milestone after the 2031. So most of the focus now is delivering on the 2030 target, which is, of course, kind of a step on the way towards our 2040 targets. But there are some things that we have to start thinking about already now to be able to deliver on the 2040 targets. Things like what does the grid infrastructure in some of the countries, and I'm sure Kim will come into this more in detail as well, but what does the electricity grid infrastructure look like in some of the production countries, and how can that be improved and built out so that we are able to get into the level of electrification we need by when we get closer to 2040. But I would also say there are things like the removals side of things, where as you said, this 2040 target is a net zero target. So it's an absolute reduction of at least 90%. And then we can use removals to kind of take out emissions from the atmosphere again. So that's also, I think, one of the things we need to start now, and we have started now, is setting up a way of kind of a market for purchasing and building the demand that's needed to actually kind of have something to buy when we get towards 2040.
Given that, we know that there are, from our work in STICA, strengths and weaknesses to the carbon accounting methodologies when you say we've reduced by this amount. From your perspective, how reliable are the calculations you're using to make these basically these numbers fall in line with the sort of trajectory that you need? What do you think? Can we rely on the numbers given all the challenges with today's carbon accounting? And is there a way to make them even more reliable, or you feel that they're sufficient?
I think there will always be some uncertainty, and as we are trying to kind of model something, we very seldom, or in our case, never actually measure emissions in a way that we have kind of a meter somewhere that is like looking at how many CO2 molecules are coming out somewhere. But we use models that, for example, a kilogram of fossil gas is burnt somewhere, and then we know we have there is kind of a factor that tells us how high those emissions are. So there will always be a level of uncertainty, and I think the approach we have is basically that we're never done. We continue to improve the way this is modeled and calculated to ensure that we both get kind of an accurate result, but also to enable us to actually take kind of action to reduce emissions. But you also have to use your energy in the right places. So if you kind of look at the extremes, we have kind of Kim's area on the production side, where we have very precise energy data on kind of monthly level from a very large set of suppliers that we can use to get a very good what should we say, approximation of what the emissions would be if we put a meter on those. And if we then on the other extreme think of something like let's say office supplies or commuting practices to getting to work, that's a lot of work to capture specific data, but it's a very small part of the emissions. So there you have to be very pragmatic and use a simplified model where we for office supplies, for example, use kind of a spend-based model. So we see how much money do we spend on this, and then we get an estimate of what that is in terms of emissions. So that gives us kind of a good coverage of the emissions, but we focus our efforts where we need to, I would say.
Do you think there's a chance that you'll get a big surprise one year, like, oh my God, we've been counting these really wrong, and suddenly you get a big bump in emissions, or vice versa?
I think the risk is decreasing with time, because we are, we're learning so much and updating so much that the scope of error kind of is disappearing. Of course, there will be. We know there will be continue to be a couple of big hurdles in front of us when it comes to reporting on data, and we also believe that there will be a couple of big switches in underlying data, like where we take some data from, and that could have an impact. But as long as the baseline is updated accordingly, we don't foresee any surprises that will change our strategy in any way.
And Kim, you said you may see a switch where you take data from a different way. Could you be concrete about that? What could that be?
No, it's more of a. Let me put it like this: we need to make sure that the industry standard is up to par with the latest and the best. That's our focus. So we will try to help that happen.
So let's move on to reminding the audience, because we're now going to get into the nuances of all this work. Your hotspots are. Can you remind us where the biggest impacts are for H&M? I think they're probably similar for the rest of the industry, but maybe you have a nuanced perspective on that.
So if we start to think about like the production of the products we sell, that is about it's more than half of the emissions when you look at the kind of from a raw material to a finished product. Kind of those steps are more than half of the emissions that we have. So that's kind of clearly the focus of and the hotspot that we have. Then, of course, there are things like the transportation that is often kind of conceived as being a big part, but most of it is being done with ocean freight, so that's quite efficient. So for 24, the transport emissions were about 5% of the total. So it's quite it is smaller, but of course something we also have quite a lot of influence over. So there is kind of a big focus on working with that as well. And then we have the use phase, or the use of sold products. So basically the customers washing, drying, and ironing, and dry cleaning, all that kind of stuff that they do with our products. But when trying to model that, coming back to your last point on data quality, it's quite difficult to get a good indication of that number, because it occurs in the future, right? When we sell a product in 2024, most of those washes will happen in later years that hasn't happened yet when you're sitting doing the accounting. So it becomes kind of a rougher number than you would like to. And in our case, it's about 20% of the emissions that we estimate come from that area. So those, I would say, are the big ones. And then there are a lot of smaller areas, like we mentioned before, office supplies and IT and cleaning services, and this whole kind of batch that are a number of expenditures. That's about 6%. So it's about the size of transport, actually. So that's one of our areas to improve data quality and try to break that up into more measurable and manageable, or what we say, more granularly measured and therefore able to influence areas to work with. But maybe, Kim, you want to say something about within the product
Yeah,
flow?
so within the production, I mean, we prefer to talk more about processes rather than tiers. But if we try to simplify it through tiers, then the production, the impact within production means that tier 1 will be responsible for about 5% of the whole production emission output. The classical tier 2 will be about 70%, and the tier 3 will be 25%. And but if we talk about hotspots and looking like more granular, it's of course within without a doubt the wet processes that is the real big challenge for us here. Both tier 1 and tier 3 are already to a big extent electrified, so there it's only, so to speak, to add renewable electricity to that. But within tier 3 and specifically the wet processes, that's where the big electrification journey will take place. And a couple of more numbers for you. I mean, from our impact perspective, if we look at dyeing and finishing, for example, only dyeing and finishing in China and Bangladesh, which are our two biggest markets, is about 44% of the emissions from production. And if we include all processes, 80% of the emissions are coming from these two countries if you do all the different processes. So that I mean, it doesn't get much hotter than that from our perspective. So dyeing and finishing is the big one. Then it's spinning is the second one, knitting and weaving, and lastly the manufacturing in those two markets.
Okay, so I know we've spent a good amount of time getting a sense where your hotspots are and how you measure them, but I assume everyone agrees if you don't measure, you can't manage this, the usual philosophy. So you know now where these hotspots are. And so what key insights or learnings have you had now on this journey? What is working, what's not working, what's getting in the way? Tell us about that.
I mean, we have a lot of focus is within my focus. Then I should put it like that. Within production is tier 1 to tier 3, since that is where the majority of energy is used, and climate is basically energy, right? So it's important that we try to not mix different sustainability topics. So that we might try not to hurt the agenda of climate. We address one problem at a time. We separate challenges between each other or from each other. And then there are, of course, good spillover effects. For example, the water agenda, where the actions needed for the water agenda are the same as we need to do for the energy. So we need then to separate them and approach them separately, but we kind of they gain from each other anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the learnings also here is the kind of the importance of this granular data and really understanding the real problem, so to speak. That this is the energy used because there are no other options, and these are the challenges that connect to this. I mean, you need to be kind of on the ground and have that data to see that in a clear perspective, and it also helps a lot with driving the conversation. Also, I would say when you go to policymakers, for example, that you can show them, oh, we have this cluster here, and there's this amounts and this kind of volumes of energy from these sources being used. I think that is kind of unsurprisingly been one of these learnings you knew you would get, but it's still, I think, from my perspective, amazing to see how strong that still is.
And that applies to all levels, right? If we do policy work, being able to really show the governments in whatever country it is, the actual data, huge advantage. Also going into a meeting with the management of a factory or the owners of a supplier and telling them, this is the data, this is how everything looks, put it up in a dashboard. It has a very strong impact. It kind of opens up for the tough discussions rather than, sitting and discussing what if. This is the fact, and where do we go from here? So we can start further ahead, so to speak.
And I can build on that kind of the policy perspective as well. We met with some different government representatives when we were in Azerbaijan for the COP, and it's really strong to sit down and kind of show them, these are the factories, these are the volumes, these are the kind of energy sources we have, and these are the challenges. Then, as Kim says, you get kind of past the high level things and get really into the specifics of kind of grid congestion or how do we kind of replace this big point source with many smaller ones, for example.
Yeah, sorry for repeating again, but I think it's a very, one of the, we often we do things, we aim for achieving something, and then we get a positive byproduct. For example, we hired our own energy efficiency expert in order to achieve, impact on the ground. But the positive side effects has been a great advancement in understanding for the different processes and the actual challenges, because the challenges, again, they are on the floor with the machine, with the team that runs the machine. That is where the energy is spent. So that kind of learnings that we are doing as an organization has been difficult to foresee, and it's very difficult to put a price on. Very important for us.
And so maybe what I was also asking is, you started working on this challenge a number of years ago, 2019 or before, and you had an idea of what you were going to do to reduce your emissions, to reduce the H&M Group's emissions. And now you look back and go, ooh, that was a surprise. I never thought it would be like that. Or, wow, this has been much more significant for us than we thought. Are there any of those kinds of things that come to mind?
Yeah, of course. You have 5-6 years ago, we were totally focused on energy efficiency. We thought that that is the path to reaching our climate goals, and we have kind of awakened from that and understand. It took a couple of years, but to understand that it's all about the carbon intensity and where the energy is coming from. The energy efficiency is very important from a cost perspective. You need to be using as little energy as humanly possible so that the electrification is cheaper, so that you can source that electricity from renewable sources. That's kind of the very simple solution to both 2030 and 2040, but that was a learning that took us many years. We mainly talked about energy efficiency for 3 years at least when I started back in 2018.
Oh, Kim, and can I dare you to explain carbon intensity in the most simple manner? Wait, it's easy to get into the weeds here. So just what do you mean that's such a different framing for you and potentially for the industry? What does that mean?
So let me put it like this. When you do energy efficiency, that is very difficult to compare because you have different machinery, you have different prerequisites and opportunities in factories. They are built different years, machines are different age, people are differently trained, and you have different opportunities to be efficient, right? So that's a difficult benchmark per se. But the other benchmark which you can use is to see how many grams of emissions do you get from producing 1 megajoule of energy, because all the processes uses energy. If you use coal as your source, you will have a high carbon intensity. If you use gas as your source, you will have a lower carbon intensity. And if you use renewable, you will have almost zero carbon intensity. So that is the simplest way I can explain, I think.
And why has that been a breakthrough? What does that do for you in terms of your strategy and your actions?
A number of things, actually. When we approached previously the suppliers and talked about emissions, there are so many things that goes into those. There are too many variables that goes into emissions. It's again how efficient you are, which is difficult to measure and benchmark. It's the volumes. Maybe you're growing as a supplier, and then you have the carbon intensity. If you simplify this and you put the targets only on carbon intensity to the supplier, it becomes easier for them to focus. It is about changing the source of the energy. How do you do that? Kick out the coal boiler or the gas boiler and electrify. Okay, I can't afford that. Okay, then you need to be more energy efficient. And so that becomes like a continuation or an enabler for that. And the second thing I would also highlight is that it's not only easier to understand for the supplier, it's also much easier internally in the company to have one KPI that is then owned by our business organization, that they can drive when they negotiate with a supplier. They take the responsibility for the carbon intensity. They don't need to know anything about climate. They don't need to know about anything. They have the carbon intensity, which is a very easy KPI to run, and that has been a a game changer for us.
Okay, so that's why I wanted to focus on that, because you've said again and again this is a game changer.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just want to wrap this piece up by asking, if you're using carbon intensity, often we hear, well, there's certain regions, countries where, moving to renewables is just not possible, right? And so if you're sourcing from, I take for example Bangladesh, and you can't get to renewables at the level you need, why does carbon intensity make a difference in that case, in terms of your overall strategy? I mean, do you simply have to leave Bangladesh if you want to achieve your greenhouse emission reductions targets? Or does carbon intensity as a strategy enable you to do something that you couldn't do before?
So that was a couple of questions and some assumptions, but
Yes.
first of all, energy, renewable electricity is available in Bangladesh. You have. I just want to point that out as a first. You have EACs in Bangladesh. Then, if you want to go into the discussion about quality and additionality, let's take that separately. But if we just state first that there is availability on renewable, then of course we have the challenge from a global from overall perspective. When you look at how much is today electrified and how much of that is coming from the grid, because that's the only way you can use EACs, for example. And that's quite a small part. But again, when I talk about the game changer, by putting the carbon intensity as a main driver for the sustainability work driven by our business organization, and on top of that, you have renewable electricity as a hygiene factor, what I'm trying to call it, and we say, if you're going to produce for us, the electricity that you purchase has to come from or has to be renewable sourced. That is the foundation, the ground. That's where we start. Then we can have discussions in the future about quality or additionality and such. But including renewable electricity in the cost of the goods, making it a hygiene factor, that is absolute key.
I guess my question was, isn't it in the case that in certain places it's difficult to get access to renewable energy?
It is difficult to get, but it's not difficult enough because everyone is not trying, right? So we can get it so far. I mean, it would be good if everybody else tried to get it so that it ran out. Then we would have a good case of building more renewable electricity, which we're also trying to do through PPAs and different type of models, as Henrik mentioned earlier. So I'm not saying that it's easy in Bangladesh. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you have to start with what's in front of you. And renewable electricity is available. It has a cost, and you can start paying that today, and you can have an instant impact on your carbon intensity. Not the biggest impact, of course, since electricity is a small part, but it's the first step. It's an important step, and it's something that needs to be the foundation of future electrification, because you cannot push the electrification agenda without first making sure that all electricity is renewable.
Okay. And maybe I have misunderstood this, but my thought is also as an overall strategy for the H&M Group, if you use carbon intensity as a method, it may be that in certain countries or markets, you get more renewables, and
Oh yeah.
better carbon intensity. Others, you get worse, and overall, you try to balance those out to reach your reduction targets.
Yes, so a brand, for example, can use carbon intensity to mathematically calculate based on whatever baseline you set and the goal you have. Then you can you can calculate what CI on average, the energy that you put in your products needs to be at on your goal um, date. So that's just a mathematical thing. This means that for us, we don't set the same goals for all the factories. We say like, this is where we need to be on an average. And if you as a supplier manages to get below that, that will be very good for your business. You will be a part of the solution for us, and we will try to drive business towards you from a climate perspective. If you are above that, you are considered a part of the problem, just as we say about ourselves, and that will, in the long run, have a negative impact on your business.
Good. Okay, that really helps me at least understand the game-changing framing of carbon intensity. Do you want to say, either of you, any more about sort of the user phase and circular business models, or innovation gaps when it comes to materials? Anything there you want to note that has been important learnings?
I think I can mention if we look at the circular business models, like focusing on resell, that represented about 0.5% of our turnover kind of last year, or about 1.5 billion SEK. So it might not kind of overwhelm in that sense, but it's actually doubled since only 2 years back. And now we offer the resell in about 30% of the market. So I think we can really see how there is a big customer interest in this, and it's building, but of course it's still a very small part of the business. So we need to kind of continue to focus on the rest of the business as well, to make that kind of significantly lower emissions. So it's kind of this balance between seeing seeing it being delivered, so to speak, this 1.5 billion SEK that it was last year, and at the same time kind of finding the right size for it as we go forward. That we need to work both on that and reductions on the rest of the business, so to speak.
And so, do you mean, Henrik, that in some cases for other companies in STICA, they've, at least in their transition plans over time, have tried to see how much of that can be about circular business models, and it's very hard now, many say, because of the limited business case and the limited incentives. H&M is seeing that that's growing, but you may not see that as the key piece to your achieving your climate reductions, or you think it is, and therefore you need to work a lot harder with the policy frameworks and such, so that that can grow even faster than it's done already. What are you saying there exactly?
Yeah, no, I'm saying that kind of there's a little bit of a duality that it's actually delivering quite well in terms of growth and how much it is delivering on its own, but it's still a small part of the business, and I think that's kind of finding that those expectations, like how do we see it a little bit, as you said, with other companies that are trying to see how big could this be. There are still kind of the same hurdles there, but this is still kind of a part, and a significant part in that sense. Even if 0.5% is not huge, it's still significant in that sense.
But I guess my question is, are you relying on that piece to achieve your 2040 targets, or you're not? Because you're not so sure how big it can get.
Yeah, I think we should not kind of hammer anything in now. I think there's a long time until 2040, until we know exactly what we'll deliver there. So we need to kind of build on all these fronts. So this will definitely be part of it, especially if we can kind of address some of the challenges raised. But we still will have this the rest of the business to consider, and that will be part of it in 2040 as well. I think that's quite clear. So.
Okay. So if you were to wrap up what you think is still standing in the way of you getting to the 2030 and 2040 targets, if you could list just a couple things, one or two things that you think these are things that we still have to address in order to really get to where we said we want to go.
So I would say, as most of the emissions is in the production part, that is where we still need to do most of the heavy lifting when it comes to reductions. So I would say that as an area, and there is a lot being done, as Kim has kind of touched on. But I think the policy work, having kind of the countries, both the physical grids and the physical infrastructure and the legislation, the legislative infrastructure in place to be able to kind of build renewables and being able to deliver it to the suppliers. I think those are kind of still the challenges. Something that a little bit, as you were in this CI conversation touching on, that there is some flexibility that more can be done in some countries, and more can be done on some factories because they have a better, more land for solar panels or something like that. But still, kind of when it comes towards 2040, then all of these fruits need to be picked. The tree needs to become empty of fruits. We cannot just start with the low-hanging ones. So I think we need to then have addressed a lot of these issues. So from my perspective, I think that is where we see the biggest kind of importance to have that in place.
And Kim, what do you think?
Yeah, I 100% agree, and it becomes clearer when you look at a production specifically, because when we talk about, or I often hear, talk about future technology, or we need new innovative technology, and I mean, as I said earlier, we have our own people on this, and I would say that, or we are saying that 90 to 95% of the technical solutions needed to fully electrify everything in the textile industry, it already exists. There are still a few smaller processes where the tech suppliers they've never been asked if they can give an electric alternative, so they haven't developed it. But let us then focus on these 90%, and let us not talk about those problems. So to stay focused on what's possible today, because for 2030, I don't see anything directly standing in our way. Possibly, sudden changes in carbon accounting rules or something like that. We have built our strategy on today's carbon accounting rules, and if they change, of course, it will be a challenge. And things that could make it easier for us to achieve it would be, of course, if we can get more brands to co-finance this transition. Some kind of financing, the transition would go faster. And I would love to see something like a commitment on renewable electricity between brands, follow RE100 and commit to a certain year, and by then it's a hygiene factor, not only at H&M, but at the industry, that products within the textile industry is sourced with renewable electricity. That market signal would make it so much easier for not only us, but for everyone trying to achieve this.
So I want to get into what you think about what's happening in the industry overall, not just with H&M, but I want to wrap up the focus on you all with a more difficult question, which is about this decoupling potential between financial growth and carbon emissions or sustainability performance overall. Theoretically, we've talked about the idea, can you really decouple these things, that even if you're reducing all your emissions, and you both sound relatively optimistic for 2030, I don't know, you'll have to tell me how optimistic you are about 2040 targets, that when we do calculations as part of STICA, we see that, companies could reduce their per product emissions over time and get better and better. But if they're growing as a company, there is the sense that their overall absolute emissions will increase. And at least the model today is that the overall absolute emissions per company needs to decrease, even if you're growing. So at one point, H&M said, your leadership said, we're going to double our revenues and have our emissions. And in our latest report, we've talked about the challenge of growth. I think we're now all talking about that across the industry and the world. How do you at H&M see this potential challenge of having, on one hand, these growth targets, financial growth targets, the traditional measures of financial health and prosperity, on the other hand, climate targets that need to reduce at a scale and pace, 56%, 90%, etc. How do you both see that?
I think, you're talking to the sustainability experts here rather than the financial or sales experts. But from our perspective, I think we have set an absolute reduction target. So that is this kind of, the revenue increase is already built into that when setting the target. The meaning of this absolute is that we can say in numbers what the emissions should be in 2030 if we reach our target. It doesn't matter if we grow. And of course, when we set a target like this, we take it seriously. We say, if we set this target, then we should deliver on it and we should do it. So we are focused on this cutting emissions in half. And the rule of this simple calculation is that doesn't matter then what the business growth is. But then, of course, that comes in because each product, each additional product will mean that we will need to there will be more emissions connected to it. So I think when we go in through this decarbonization journey, once we reduce the emissions from production, if we would have a close to fully electrified production and fully renewable coverage for that, then we would have a very small, what you would say, marginal impact from adding an additional product. So in that sense, this is kind of built into the plan. But then when you think about it year on year, I think it's a different question. And that's one of the reasons why you see, it's not a straight line. We don't draw a straight line from 2019 to 2030 and then 2040. This is exactly what emissions will be every year. But there are fluctuations that occur in that space, basically, because of that. So, that's how I see it from this perspective, that we have the 2030 and the 2040 in our sights, and that's where we kind of focus the effort to get to that point.
Okay.
I see it a little bit like I know we've had this discussion many times, you and me, Mike. But from my perspective, also, it's like the science is saying we need to have 50% every 10 years. That is what we base most of the models on. That's what we based our targets on. We didn't set the targets based on what we thought we could achieve. We set it on what science told us it should be. That also makes us a part of the problem. We're a big company. We have huge emissions. We are a part of the problem. We can reduce our emissions, and if we do that stronger than 50%, we're a part of the solution. So I don't really see this connection. If you are a startup company and you grow 500% yearly, and you have emissions per piece going down, for the planet, for the climate, it doesn't matter what you do per piece. It's the total that counts. I just see it as, don't make climate your front and center thing if you have a massive growth. If you have a normal growth, then it's not a problem if you focus on carbon intensity, because you can get that close to zero.
Right, and I'm just thinking that, you know, if it was the case that H&M or another company suddenly was not doing enough well financially, according to the owners and shareholders, and suddenly they said, "Well, great, we have the climate target, but we need to prioritize our growth, which could undermine our climate target." Then you're in that sort of challenging
Oh
situation.
yeah, I mean, degrowth will of course lead to fewer investments in general, and specifically anything that has a premium cost, for example, that it often has within sustainability. So, yeah, I agree on that.
Okay, so let's r- wrap up the discussion with your views on the industry as a whole. How would you both rate how the industry is doing around decarbonization, uh, you know, just in general, and considering new developments, like some people call even ultra fast fashion, the Sheins, the Temus are often used as examples there. But how is the industry doing overall, do you think? And how would you rate other brands and retailers, and what other companies do you think are interesting to watch?
I'm not going to say anything negative about any other brand, of course. What I can say from a positive perspective, having worked with them a couple of different projects, is actually Bestseller. They have an approach to the climate topic that is very similar to ours. They most importantly, they have an acceptance that the transition of the climate transition, the electrification journey that we're on, they accept that it will come to at a cost. They understand that it will, we will not be able to get 100% payoff in terms of claims on the current rules on claims around climate calculations. But they're very progressive and open to discussing any kind of project, to drive the agenda. So it's a shame that we don't share more factories than we do with them, because then we could probably push the agenda a little extra together. But I'm not going to point the finger at any brand. I don't think Henrik will either. Do you have any comment,
I
Henrik?
can't get you to point fingers. Uh, uh, but how do you think the industry doing overall? I mean, if 10 is brilliant and 1 is terrible, where does the industry stand, you think?
I think we're too slow as an industry, right? We have to be fair. There is this reluctance to accept the cost for the transition, and it seems to be okay, maybe not preferred, but at least okay to kind of wait it out, either for the suppliers to just upgrade their old machinery, or to have look for some kind of international organizations or other brands to lead the financing part. So rather poor from my side. What do you say, Henrik?
Yeah, I mean, in some way, to summarize it, I think I agree with you. But there's such a huge spread of companies, so it's hard. The average is not so representative
True.
in this case. But if you try a median, then I think maybe that will be quite poor. That there's quite a lot of companies that lack engagement. And I think, like, from coming from consulting before as well, having looked at quite a lot of different industries, I think still the kind of fashion industries were very much on top of the real issues in the industry that kind of not other industries have the same one. So there's a lot of industry collaboration, both on a global and kind of on a local scale, as you are, a living testament to, Mike, that there is this kind of willingness to work like that in this industry, which I think is great. But I would like to see it deliver a little bit more. And I'm very kind of, you try to zoom out and observe what's happening, that there's been quite a few industry initiatives or kind of related initiatives that try to drive change in different ways. You have STICA as you the example, Mike, and then you have UNFCCC. There's Fashion Pact, the Global Fashion Agenda. All of these actors that try to drive this change and collect the industry actors in one. And I feel like there's kind of a, I don't think renaissance is the right word, but kind of a need for them to move into a new stage, like this previous stage of making kind of high level commitments and being not nice to kind of deliver on one or two of the commitments. I think that needs to also upgrade for the credibility of these initiatives to more work on accountability and make sure that the members are kind of delivering on what they promise. So I think that's also an interesting kind of development in the industry to see where that goes, how all of these initiatives handle now the increasing kind of expectations on to deliver on the things that has been promised towards 25 and 2030 and
Well,
so
I think
on.
that's very interesting. So there's been a lot of, it's easy to make a commitment. I mean, relatively easy to make the commitments, but what happens when you are not delivering on them? And do these platforms say, sorry, you're not serious enough, you're not showing progress?
I mean, I can't agree more. I can't count the number of initiatives through the years that I've been a part of that has just been watered out, usually by focusing on something else all of a sudden, or including more topics, and then it just becomes nothing. I think the shining star currently is a Paralympic Institute, who are kind of taken this focus on board, that they are doing one thing. They work on implementation. They are directly to the factory. They are directly in discussion with the factory owners, and they're focusing on impact today. They are not focusing on creating nice overarching commitments on a high level. They are actually in the factory. So I think hopefully, possibly, maybe they could be the long-term solution for our industry if we manage to finance them properly.
Okay. So I have two more questions. One is this broader picture of what we outline in our latest STICA report from 2024, which basically we have lots of conclusions, both from the signatories, what is needed, which a lot of them are government types of action and intervention. But overall, our conclusion was that if you're going to sort of release the entrepreneurial and business drive to address decarbonization at the pace and scale required for the industry, we're arguing you need much more financial penalties and rewards for doing this. So if you're not, you were just saying in terms of platforms accountability, but also if you're not reducing your emissions, should you somehow be affected negatively economically? And if you are, if H&M moves at the pace, reaches the 56% or even more, somehow you get a financial reward for that. Do you two have any opinions on that? I know you're going to say, well, we're the sustainability guys and we're not involved so much on that other side, although you do work with green investment and green bonds at some level, giving input on that. But is it wrong to say what we say, that we need, if this is going to move faster at the pace and scale needed, we need more financial penalties and rewards? Is that a fair comment?
I'm not sure financial penalties. I mean,
How did I know you were going to say that? No
no, but
companies want the penalty, right? Come on
well,
now.
I mean, I could turn that around, Mike, and say that I don't see us getting those penalties when it comes to leadership or lagging on climate. I mean, on the other hand, if you talk about like a taxation on carbon, for example, we would support that, obviously. If that's the kind of penalties you're referring to. What I would like to highlight a little bit is that something that I often see. There are these different comparisons and benchmarks from NGOs towards the usual suspects, so to speak. But what about those that are not on those lists? So, I mean, for me, if anything should be penalized, it's the inactivity, the ones hiding in the background. But doing the wrong thing, trying and doing the wrong thing should not be penalized.
Fair enough. Henrik, do you have any views on the financial penalties and reward?
Um, I think, like you said, Kim, that carbon taxing, that is well. Or if I step back and say, I think we need ambitious legislation that will kind of bring everyone on board. And I think a little bit, depending on what your kind of theory of how this change will come about, this us taking this voluntary work on ourselves to actually make these changes, even though there is no kind of legislative requirement for it, I think is one way of also showing that we think this is possible, and this is how it can be done. So I think that should be clear, that we want an ambitious legislation, but it's important also that it comes out in the right way, so that those who have already taken a lot of action are included. For example, there's the kind of you want to avoid having only be able to use a country average if you would have like a tax in the EU, for example, because then you would be stuck, no matter if you have done a lot of decarbonization or not, you would be stuck with kind of one value. So that kind of wrinkle needs to be ironed out in any legislations that come. But I think if it's financial, or if it's kind of a market access or whatever, I think that's kind of beyond me to say exactly what it should look like. But I think we need that kind of drive to improve. And then if you look at as an industry, I mean, and if you look at, for example, we did quite an in-depth kind of climate risk analysis, the TCFD, this financial risk analysis. So you try to look at the effects of both climate change and kind of a society trying to handle climate change. So, for example, then carbon taxes and things like carbon tolls will come into that. And you can then make quite a detailed analysis of the financial value of your current work under different scenarios. So I think that's also a tool that you can use to understand the value of reducing that ton in that market, etc.
But I would like to actually repeat what just to highlight what Henrik said there, because if we end up in a situation where companies are not, if it's not possible for companies to make claims or estimate their emissions on their actual units, instead just using a country average, that will completely abolish, for once, the work that we have done in every market with our suppliers. It will also remove any incentive for leadership, and it will highly reward the laggers. Those that are doing nothing will be the winners of that. So that is a high risk that I would like to really point out here. You asked me earlier what could get us off our trajectory, and this would get us off our trajectory for sure.
So that's a little bit what we're talking about: good legislation that's thought through.
Yeah.
So let's summarize. If I could then ask you, if you haven't already stated these, or you can restate them, emphasize them again. If you were to pick two things to prioritize, if you were to pick two things to prioritize to help the entire industry to decarbonize at the pace and scale needed, what would those two things be?
I can do the obvious thing. We need industry-wide commitment on sourcing of renewable electricity per date. That would be an amazing signal to the industry.
How would that look like? Like, you mean a commitment by each brand, or what do you mean?
No, so for example, saying that our commitment is by 2030, 100% of the electricity that goes into the products should come from renewable sources. That's our commitment. It doesn't need to be 2030, but it needs to be a commitment. And I don't think there's any commitment, not from where I'm sitting. No other commitment would be stronger as a signal to this industry than that as of now.
Okay. Do you have another one, or Henrik, do you want to jump in now?
Henrik, take first. I can come back.
It's hard to pick. I think here and now, I think boring answer is like data. That more companies need to look at the real impact and the real kind of information around what goes on in throughout their value chain, so that they can join in these initiatives that Kim was mentioning. I think for a lot of companies, taking that step, as Kim mentioned, will be very hard because they don't have electricity data for a lot of their supply chain, right? So how can you commit to it and how can you follow up on it? So it's a little bit of a boring and maybe predictable answer, but I think that's one enabler to kind of get things to actually happen down the line. So I put a vote on that for doing it right here and now. I think that's important. And then we don't see for example, if you think about it a little bit longer, I think grid expansion and grid stability needs also to be a part of a lot of these grids that are built on pure fossil, very plannable production and very unstable, will be harder to decarbonize quickly if we don't kind of focus on or expanding those. And if you don't have access to data, you don't see that problem until it's kind of in your face. But I think that's more of a long-term fix that is needed in quite a lot of places as well.
I think this comes down a little bit to also something that I used to say is like, let's do what's possible today. Let's not look for this perfect solution 10 years in the future that probably is better than what we have today. Let's not look for that. Let's start with what we have in front of us and solve those issues now. I think that is also a strong message or communication from my side.
I think that's a good place to conclude. Henrik and Kim, thank you very, very much for taking the time to give us your latest thoughts on the H&M work. And we appreciate this, and we'll keep an eye on you regularly to see how it's going. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.